Last time at the end we asked the question, what if a letter of Paul were to be found? Should somebody add it to the Bible? Why or why not? Was there anything that anyone wanted to come back to about that? I know we sort of had more things to talk about, I think. That was the impression I had anyway, that there were more things that you wanted to say than we had time for as we ran out of time. So is there anything anybody wants to come back to in relation to that? I will take that as a no. Why is it pretty unlikely that this would actually happen, that we'd find an authentic letter of Paul that nobody had heard of before? Can you think of any reasons why this scenario is particularly unlikely? Yes?
Well, I mean, so far, most of the texts that we've done are found together with other texts as well. So, I mean, it would be kind of odd to just happen upon one letter, like kind of not in an area that, I mean, well, I guess making up. They found like the Dead Sea Scrolls up in one spot, and then they found others around that area. But if you ended up finding one of Paul's letters not in an area like that, it would be very unlikely.
Okay. Yeah, certainly when we start to find manuscripts of Paul's letters, it's at the point at which they've already started to be collected and circulated among churches. And the main thing we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to spend a little time on this, and then hopefully we'll leave some time for discussion as well. I'm trying to do some introductory stuff in more of a lecture format. I'm hoping that this will not be the way we'll continue the whole of the semester. But it seems that general information about where the Bible comes from and the manuscripts that we have or don't have are the sorts of things that it's more useful for me to spend some time talking about. But I hope that once we get into actual reading parts of the Bible, that we'll take things in a more discussion-oriented format. One of the things I mentioned last time, you all gave the right answer to this question when I asked you, where are the original manuscripts? Right? Your response was silence, and that's right, we don't have them. And that's one reason why it's particularly unlikely that we'd come across an authentic letter of Paul that would suddenly resurface, because even those letters that Christian churches have taken the effort to preserve and to collect and have become, eventually part of Scripture, we don't have the originals. And so that an original letter of Paul, which nobody had copied and nobody had circulated, would have survived when the originals of these ones have not, does seem pretty unlikely. And the question I want us to focus on is, why don't we, well, I guess we could put it this way, why don't we all just go home, right? We don't have the Bible, the original thing. And so what do we do in that circumstance, right? Because we have this, but we don't have the originals. And so how do we get from what somebody wrote once upon a time to what we have here? Right? And that's the question that I want us to focus on. What do you think scholars do, and historians and textual critics, people who study specifically the text of these ancient writings, Bible translators, what do they do in the absence of the originals? Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And also, I think I could believe that they would cast a lot of the stories orally, and it did have a lot of merit to it. Like the stories were pretty correct. Like everyone said them fairly similarly. So I mean, there is some. You can't just think, oh well, everyone had the exact same story. There has to be some fact to it, right?
That's a question, right? Rather than a sort of an answer to the question. Yeah, that's really taking us back. If we're talking about oral tradition, we're really getting back to the period between events that are supposed to have happened and the writing down of those events, right? So before we even get to the stage of people copying written versions of the story, right? What was happening before that? And obviously one thing that may be disconcerting if you are concerned for the question of what actually happened and how certain can we be about what actually happened, is that that oral stage, we only know about it in as much as it had an effect on things that were written down. Right? If any of you want to change your major to physics and invent a time machine, you might be able to go back and see things. Barring that, we have to use some of the methods of historical study to try and piece together the evidence and figure out what can we be certain of, with what degree of certainty. And we'll actually talk about some of the methods of historical study a bit later in this class, assuming we have time. But yeah, the whole subject of oral tradition is an interesting one. And the question of how it may be relevant even to the manuscript transmission phase that we're considering is an interesting one, because this is a primarily oral culture. Things that were written in a manner very different than we would tend to write things today. I'll show you some examples. And so the question of how scribes worked, even how authors worked when they had written sources before them. Did they have an assistant who read things to them? Did they read it beforehand and then work from memory? Because even some of the things that facilitate writing that we take for granted today, like desks, right? And lots of you have multiple, you have maybe a textbook, you have some notes, you have paper, ballpoint pen, right? Lots of things that make things easier, which we take for granted. And it's hard to imagine that there was a time when scribes and authors didn't have even those things to work with. And so the very question of if you're working quite possibly on your lap or on your knee, possibly ink, with the ink bottle and all those older things, how do you work with sources? Right? It's something that doesn't get asked often enough. Yeah. Question.
If we don't have the original documents, then how can we try to guess when
That's a great question.
Written down?
That's a great question. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Yeah, and in some cases it's far more certain than in others, right? There are works of literature in the Bible, for instance, the book of Job, we can talk about when it's set, right? And it's set sort of in time immemorial, right? Ancient times, possibly before the nation of Israel had emerged. That's not the same thing as the question of when it was written. And to be honest, we don't really know, right? There's nothing in it that's that specific, right? It's about a person not even in Israel, doesn't mention kings and rulers, doesn't mention any of those kinds of things that people normally work on to try and figure out dates. And so some of the things that might give some indication of when something's written when we don't have a date attached to it, which is the case in the biblical texts, are things that they mention, things that they allude to. The latest events that are hinted at, right, that the author shows some clear sign of awareness of, is the earliest date when the final form of that book, in the form in which we now have it, could have been written, right? If the author is referring to things that have happened and is aware of them and knows of them as events in history and is making some allusion to them or perhaps even directly referring to them, the book was not written before that. The question of how much later than the events it was written is often uncertain as well. One of the things that's helpful in the case of, let's say, the New Testament documents is that on the one hand we have the period in which Christianity emerges, right, as an earliest date. On the other hand, we have writings of church fathers who begin to, that's the sort of generic name given to the leaders and authors of the early church in the post-New Testament period, who make reference to and quote some of these works, right? And so clearly by the time they start quoting them, they must exist, right? Oftentimes within that span of 50 years, sometimes 100 years, we may have a lot of uncertainty, right? And you'll sometimes see a range of dates, right? And what that means is that sometimes there's definite uncertainty. One thing I want to mention before we look at the procedure of textual criticism and how scholars deal with the fact that we don't have the originals is that this is not something that's unique to the Bible, right? Most of the literature that was written in antiquity that's come down to us has come down to us in copies. And in fact, in the case of many of the biblical texts, we have relatively early copies compared to some of the earliest copies we have of some other works from antiquity. And so this is not something that's a unique problem to biblical studies. I will pass around a critical edition of the Greek New Testament. But before I do that, which is it's a collation of texts, let me show you just some samples of manuscripts. This one, as you can see, is not in perfect condition around the edges. And the older the manuscript, the further back in time we're going, the more fragmentary our manuscripts are. Right? One of our earliest manuscripts is, in fact, of any part of the New Testament, is a fragment of, or part of, the Gospel of John. Right? And it's not complete by any means, but it indicates that the Gospel had reached Egypt by the early 2nd century, and certainly a date any later than that, or even very close to that time, is unlikely. Right? As we move on, as we get to a period when Christianity has some state support, right, after the time of Constantine, is no longer a persecuted minority group, and so increasingly has access to professional scribes and things like that, we'll find that there are manuscripts that are not only somewhat more legibly written in some cases, but also in better condition. And this is just, again, things that you might have even been able to figure out from common sense, right? Most things, the older they are, the worse condition they're in, if they've made it down to us at all. You may have noticed that in each of these, right, you can see that there's very little, if anything, in terms of punctuation, spaces between words, and in most cases that is something that scribes manage to deal with, but you're probably all aware from taking notes that if you have similar words, or if you lose your place, you can copy something twice or miss something out. And one of the things that happens in the process of transmission, and very often we can realize that it happened because we have manuscripts to compare, is the duplication or the dropping out of something because of similarities. I thought, just for fun, I'd give you a couple of classic examples of things that can be understood more than one way in English if you write them all in capital letters, no spaces, no punctuation. What does the first one say? Yeah. Yeah, so could be either. And is the second one, is that describing a natural event or a supernatural event? What do you think? Has anyone had this happen to them? Depends if you read it as I saw, last night at dinner I saw abundance on the table, or last night at dinner I saw a bun dance on the table. So there you go. These are obviously highly contrived, and in most cases, even if a scribe's eye flitted along, very often they realized that they had missed something out and were able to go back and fix it. And so a lot of our manuscripts, in fact, do have corrections in them, and in some cases, right, particularly once we get to the point where these works are being passed on and copied by people who regard them as sacred scripture, they're taking a lot of care, putting a lot of effort into it, and so you have people who are double-checking the work of other scribes. And we'll talk about at least one example of that in a moment. This is what a critical edition of the Greek New Testament looks like, and I'll pass it around so you can flip through it and take a look at it. I'm guessing that most of you don't read Greek, so it may be Greek to you, as they say. One of the things, hopefully, though, that you can see is that there are extensive footnotes, right? And if you flip through that, one thing that you will be able to see is that there are footnotes on every page. And those footnotes indicate differences between manuscripts, right? And what's in the text there, and that's what's used by translators when they translate the New Testament into English, is essentially the work of a committee trying to decide, trying to make a best judgment about what the original text is likely to have contained. The result, interestingly enough, is not exactly the same as any one Greek manuscript that survived from antiquity. How do they try and decide among the evidence? Well, in some cases, it's clear that there's just been a copying error. In some cases, it's a difference between two similar sounding words, right? And so we can understand how the error crept in. In some cases, we have what look like deliberate changes because it has some kind of theological significance, right? And I think the textbook mentioned some examples of that. Apart from that, one of the things that text critics can look at is the question of distribution of manuscripts. So for instance, if we have manuscripts from roughly the same time period from Rome, from Greece, from North Africa, let's say Alexandria, and several of them agree with one another, and one of them has a distinctive reading, chances are that the one that has the wider geographical spread goes back to an earlier manuscript that made it to these different places, right? And so by comparing manuscripts and manuscripts from different parts of the world, that can give an indication of which is most likely to be the original reading. In other cases, it's simply a question of trying to figure out what the harder reading is. And oftentimes, it's safe to assume that the more difficult reading, if we can put it that way, is more likely to be original. Because if you imagine yourself as a scribe copying the New Testament, let's say, right, copying Gospel of John or something, and you come across something that is hard to understand, you may think, oh, somebody earlier made a mistake. I'm going to fix it, right? If you come across something that's perfectly intelligible, you're unlikely to say, let me see if I can make this a little bit more challenging for the reader, right? And so in most cases, if there's something that is what we might call the harder reading, right? Either more difficult to make sense of, more difficult theologically, whatever it might be, oftentimes it's assumed that that's more likely to be original, simply dealing with the probable direction of change in the course of transmission.